Do you have a DonorsChoose.org project that needs funding? Today's sponsor is Advancement Courses, and they are donating 10% of their sales until September 28th to DonorsChoose.org projects. And if you're needing professional development for yourself, you get 20% off their 200-plus online PD courses using the special code just for 10-minute teacher listeners. So stay tuned at the end of the show. How to Unleash Student Motivation to Succeed, Episode 361. The 10-Minute Teacher Podcast with Vicki Davis. Every weekday, you'll learn powerful, practical ways to be a more remarkable teacher today. So today we're talking with Chris Holmes, a 19-year teacher who's now teaching in St. Louis. Chris, something happened about 5 years ago in your teaching career that changed everything for you. Tell us what happened.
There was a time I was teaching journalism at a very large school in St. Louis County, about 2,300 students in the school. And I was teaching journalism, and there was always a great relationship I had with the students. They liked me, I liked them. They usually worked hard for me. But this one time, they weren't. And they had an assignment due that night, and I went home to check their work. I was going to put comments on their writing. And 3 of the 20 students had turned in their work. I was a little shocked and, frankly, a little frustrated. But then I thought about it. I thought, how am I going to approach this with the kids? It's not going to do any good to get frustrated with them. It's not going to do any good to get mad at them. So when I went to class the next day, what I did was I told them how many of the assignments came in, and I said, let's just scrap the lesson for the day, and let's rearrange the chairs in a circle, and I want you to talk to me. I want you just to tell me what's going on, because we have a great relationship. There's got to be a reason that you're not doing the work. And once they realized I wasn't mad and that I was just there to listen, then they told me. Things they told me broke my heart. Things like their parents were ignoring them. They didn't feel like they could succeed in school. Everybody was smarter. Everybody was better looking. Some kids talked about hurting themselves, about hating themselves, about not feeling like there was a reason to graduate or to go to college or any of this. Just very, very sad stories. There were tears. People were very honest. And it dawned on me that no matter how dynamic of a journalism teacher I was, I couldn't really get to the content because of all this other stuff that was getting in the way of the kids wanting to learn. Because they told me, they said, Mr. Holmes, we really want to learn this, but frankly, there's a lot of stuff going on in our lives, and it's hard. And that was an epiphany for me. And that made me kind of rethink my whole role. I'd been teaching for, 15 years as a journalism teacher, and decided that maybe I should look at this education thing a little differently. So I started looking into motivation and apathy, and frankly became obsessed with it. Went back to college, got working on a master's degree with educational psychology, and decided that I wanted to do something in regard to teaching self-efficacy and teaching motivation. So an opportunity came up at a very small new private high school in St. Louis. To give you some context, 12 students were in our first class in the whole school, a freshman class of 12. So I went from 2,300 students to 12. And it allowed me the freedom then to approach teaching in ways that I couldn't in a more traditional environment. So we taught neuroplasticity. We taught the learning curve. We taught social emotional learning. I taught them about self-efficacy. We talked about self-talk all the time, the things that we say to ourselves inside of our head. And I taught them motivation. And we studied motivation. We looked at the research. And so when we went into this, you could tell that they were starting to change. They were starting to look at themselves a little differently, look at their possibility for success a little differently. You know, I gave them questionnaires like the mindset survey. We talked about grit. You know, I gave them strength value, VIA strength assessments. So we looked at all this stuff in addition to the content. Now, did I cover less content? Yeah, I probably did, but they learned at such a deeper level because they were learning all of this other stuff about themselves and about their brains and, frankly, about their hearts. So one day I was at the Science Center with my grandson. We were in the gift shop, and I saw a gyroscope, and I thought, wow, I love gyroscopes. He's never seen a gyroscope. He was 4 years old. I'm going to buy him a gyroscope. So I bought it, and we went home, and I put the string in it, and I zipped it out, and it spun like crazy, and I put it on my finger and then a pencil, and he's like, whoa, that's so awesome. And I knocked it on the ground, and it still kept spinning. He's like, oh, Papa, that's amazing. And then, of course, it slowed down, and then it fell over, and I had to get it, string it again to make it go again. This thing happened to me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what's going on with my students. So as teachers, we get these kids going, we motivate them externally, and they can do all kinds of funky things. They can defy gravity, they can be resilient, but because it's external motivation, it doesn't last. and they slow down and they fall over, and we have to pick them up and thread the string again and get them going again. And I thought, what we need to be able to develop intrinsic motivation. We need to be able to walk away and they can be motivated on their own. And that's what was lacking. And then I was like, okay, how do I do that? So I'm studying educational psychology and motivation, and I'm trying to think of ways to do this. And this gyroscope idea kept coming back to me. And I thought, you know what? This reminds me of this thing I learned in class called self-determination theory. And I'm sure that most people have heard of it. I hadn't heard of it at the time, but it's the leading theory on human motivation, not just in school, but human motivation in general. And it basically involves three components: autonomy, having some control or some say over what you're doing; competence, believing that you can actually succeed at something; and relatedness, having a connection with other people. And when those three things are in place, intrinsic motivation can develop and thrive. When they aren't, then it's very difficult for intrinsic motivation to happen. So I thought, what if I could develop a class somehow or an environment that would specifically, explicitly teach intrinsic motivation, those three components of intrinsic motivation. So one of the things that I wanted to do was have a physical model. My students were familiar with this because I'd talked about it all year. One of them was really into 3D modeling. And I said, Brendan, is there any way that you could, I had drawn up this drawing of this gyroscope, only instead of the disc in the middle, I had a human, a student. And then I had this idea, if I had these three magical rings that somehow spun around the student, they would cause the energy to keep the kid going. And these three rings were autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And as long as the kid had these in their lives, then they could be thriving. They would be flourishing. And I had this drawing, and I said, Brendan, can you make a 3D image of this thing? Can you design it on the computer and print it on our 3D printer? He said, yeah, I can do that. And he did. And it was this beautiful human gyroscope that had these spinning rings. And I thought, oh my gosh, it's amazing. But I wasn't satisfied. I wanted a computer animation of it. I was going to give a talk, and I thought it'd be cool if I had this big computer animation to illustrate what it was I was talking about. That what we needed to do in school was develop these three things. And this would keep the child thriving and act like a gyroscope to defy gravity and have resilience. So I was at another academy I teach at in the summer at the University of Missouri, in a gifted academy, and I had a professor design this for me. And it's really a fabulous animation. It's exactly what I was talking about. And it's this gyroscope where this kid starts spinning in the middle, and then the three rings gradually start to join it and spin around it, and that's what keeps the child going. The idea is this, that our job in teaching is not to be these dynamic, everybody loves you kind of a teacher, but to develop intrinsic motivation so the teacher can literally step away and the child can thrive on its own. So the child can leave the home and the parents can know that the child is thriving on their own. That's our job as a teacher, to prepare kids for life. So I decided that this was what I was all about. The rest of my educational career was going to be about studying motivation and figuring out a way to teach it, which led me to Backtracking Apathy. So Backtracking Apathy is a program or a project that I created where I basically travel the country interviewing high school students about apathy and motivation and when they lost it and why they lost it and what schools could do to change it and what they think the most important thing in high school is to learn and all this kind of stuff. And I did this last summer. I went to 17 different states and talked to dozens of kids. Next year, I'm going to all 48 because it's incredibly enlightening, the stories that they tell. And they are incredibly consistent with self-determination theory. Almost all of the stories that I hear come back to one of these three things: a lack of competence, a lack of autonomy, and a lack of connectedness. And when kids lose motivation, it's because of one of those or more than one of those three things. So when I start my PhD next year, the research is going to be creating a curriculum with students. So it's called Youth Participatory Action Research, where together we create this curriculum. And then I teach it freshman year, same group of kids, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and we track both their academic progress, their grit, their mindset, their happiness. And we'll see if we can make a difference compared to other kids who don't have this class. So that's kind of where I'm at with this project. And it kind of just started back in this school when my kids told me, I can't learn this stuff because this other stuff is weighing on me too heavily.
I think it's fascinating, just the journey that you've taken. Now, what do you say to those who say, let's just pull out grit as just one little piece of this, that there are some kids who have such a difficult time in life that when people say, oh, just have grit, that it's not fair. It's not really understanding what those children are coming from.
So there's significant research that shows that, yes, even kids who grow up in those environments can develop grit. The thing is, it's really not fair to say to a kid, oh, come on, just have grit. It has to be taught. That's what's lacking in schools. We might mention it. I think because the book has become popular and the research has become popular and growth mindset super popular, we mention it to kids, but we don't really explicitly teach it. Like one of the questions I asked kids when I was going around the country was, what's the most important thing you can learn in high school? None of them said academic things. None of them said math, science, English, and a couple personal finance, but the vast majority were respect, love, resilience. These were the things they wanted to learn about. So when you talk about teaching grit, what you're talking about is teaching, to a certain extent, human learning and human behavior, psychology. And when kids understand how humans react and how the brain actually develops, then they're more aware of what it takes to build grit. But to just tell someone, oh, come on, suck it up, have some grit. No, that's really not fair. That's not a cool thing to do.
This whole intrinsic motivation, of course, that's kind of the holy grail of what we're trying to do, because our goal is independence and joy and living life and finding purpose and really helping these kids be difference makers in the world. And these are all things that we have to talk about. Thanks, Chris. From now until September 28th, Advancement Courses, an online provider of professional development for K-12 teachers, is donating 10% of their sales to funding DonorsChoose.org projects. Go to advancementcourses.com/give to submit your project today. And if you're in need of professional development, the 10-Minute Teacher listeners like you can get 20% off any online courses with the code COOL20. That's COOL 20. With this coupon, a 3 grad credit course for continuing education, salary advancement, or recertification is only $359. So go to advancementcourses.com/coolcat to learn more and make sure you use that coupon code COOL20. Never stop learning. Thank you for listening to the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. You can download the show notes and see the archive at coolcatteacher.com/podcast. Never stop learning.